Hello, welcome to Music Between the Numbers. My name is Andy Jaski, and I'm a musician and songwriter, but I'm also an economist and statistician who is interested in quantitative things and things you can measure. I apologize right off the bat because I don't have a teleprompter or whatnot, and so I'll be reading a little bit, so you'll just have to put up with the home production. First, a bit about the format of these videos. I'll start off with a video introduction, and then we'll move to what is mostly a PowerPoint presentation, where I'll be explaining and exploring numbers, and then I'll return to video for the end and for some final thoughts. So what is music between the numbers and how did it come about? Well, a while back I read a book a friend recommended. It was called Baseball Between the Numbers. And it was all about sabermetrics, the analytics side of the game, the Moneyball side. And later I called my first album Life Between the Numbers, as I was trying to make some music while still having, kids in school and a career in the financial services. And then in 2020, I left full-time work in the financial services. And since then, I've been spending a lot of time on music, writing it, recording it, learning more about it, listening to it, and studying it. So besides my economics background, I have a Pro Tools certificate from Berklee College of Music that I obtained a few years back. And I play guitar and sing. As part of my musical journey, I follow a fellow named Rick Beato on YouTube. He's an exceptional musician and an exceptional music teacher. I have his theory book and his ear training course, and I highly recommend both. And he had a particular episode that resonated with me, since I'm a boomer, called Why Boomers Hate Pop Music. And I was born right in the middle of the baby boom, so when I was younger, I heard my dad complain about the Beatles as a kid, and I thought, well, I'm not going to be like that when I get older. And in some way, that's right, because I don't complain about the Beatles now that I'm older. But as I've had more time away from quant work, I was trying to listen to some good recent music, and I've been exposed to some newer music, went out at a bar or something like that, and I started thinking, I think I've heard 2 or 3 good songs in the last 10 years that I like, and I consider myself pretty open-minded and progressive on that kind of thing, so I was like, what's up with that? Well, in Rick's video, he started going through a variety of things that he felt that boomers and other people of different ages don't like in current popular music. And this is where I'm going to switch over to PowerPoint mode and begin with listing out a summary of what those are. So any errors or omissions are completely on me. So let's go through Rick's list. First, no tempo variation. Sometimes people write in tempo changes or use different time signatures, but one big difference is there's generally a live drummer keeping the beat without what is called a click track or MIDI instruments tied to a grid, especially pre-1980s. That largely doesn't exist anymore, and it takes away a bit from the humanness of the performance. Second point is repetitive sounds. These 808s and 909s, Roland drum machines are just everywhere, and they now dominate all kinds of music. The third point is all diatonic changes, typical major and minor scales, and no key changes or modulations. So everything's played on the same basic scales, and it can be pleasing to the ear and catchy, but it's not very innovative. Grunge was a major movement, for example, where there were a lot of more chromatic scales. So a next point is the use of 4 chords or less, or very few chords, and not using other chords that are outside of a particular key. So as a counterexample, Rick mentions 50 years ago, Bridge Over Troubled Water, and I looked at that, and there were 19 chords in that song. So that's something we're going to evaluate within this particular video. Another point is no dynamic variation. Dynamic variation in the past used to come from human performance, and now it doesn't come from human performance, but from what is called additive production. It's putting in more instruments and sounds as the song moves on in a somewhat formulaic manner to try to approximate the dynamic build you would get in the past from human dynamic build. Another point is that there's a lack of melody, a lack of innovative melody. So he calls it nursery rhyme type melody, and you have that or rapping, and it often makes the song catchy. Another point is that songs are auto-tuned. We get very robotic vocals and other vocal adjustment tuning, and sometimes auto-tune is used as an effect, just like a reverb or a wah-wah pedal, but too often it's just used to clean up poor vocals. And finally, we all probably have to acknowledge that there is an element of nostalgia that does play a role in liking older music. Even if music were completely the same, a lot of people would just want to hear the good old songs of their youth. So can we measure any of these things? There's an awful lot there to try to evaluate, but let's start with two sets of measures. First, chord count, since that will not only tell us about that particular metric, but also give insight into whether melodies are simpler. They almost have to be with fewer chords. Second, we'll look at Spotify audio features. Here is a list of the different Spotify audio features. Using Spotify for developers and some JSON code they generate, I was able to build the database of most of these features for the 660 top songs, the top 10 songs over 66 years. So in future episodes, I'll go into depth explaining and examining the results from that analysis, and I'll go into more depth explaining all of these features and what they are. For now, I'll just give you this peek here at the features that are out there, and we'll discuss them more in future episodes. So let me talk a little bit more about the songs we're going to analyze. So via Wikipedia, I pulled the top 10 songs for each year over this 66-year period. So it's only the most popular of the popular. And I did it from there just to have a very consistent database. So the top 10 are from Billboard as of the following year. And this is probably when the earliest boomers in 1955 were starting to listen to some popular music. The data does go back another 10 years, but at that point we're talking more about music-oriented people born in the 20s and 30s. That will likely be a follow-up to these first several episodes. For now, the last 66 years we'll get our kicks for the last 66. Side note, I was born in 1956, smack dab in the middle of boomerdom. So here are the data sources for the number of chords. First, I went to a site called ultimateguitar.com. And as a backup reference that I used fairly frequently, I used another site called chordify.net. Not every song is on Ultimate Guitar, so Chordify was a very good backup source, and also sometimes a check if the Ultimate Guitar ones didn't seem particularly correct or I had some concern about them. There are different versions on Ultimate Guitar. I typically use the highest star rating that there when there were a large number of versions, and if there were only one or two or a few reviews, I might have used a lower rated version that had tons of reviews. So they give 1 to 5 stars for the quality of the version. They have professional versions as well, but I use the free versions, and most of them are pretty accurate. I check Chordify at times, if not on Ultimate Guitar, or they seemed to be off or didn't have very many reviews. I counted inversions as chords, so D is different than D with an F sharp in the bass. So some judgment goes into which set of chords to use and exactly what the counts are. So I know that there are both musicians and data analysts who are just cringing a little bit right now. You think I might have missed a chord here or there or had some kind of inconsistency. And yes, there's probably a little bit of that. But this isn't a referee journal study, and I think the data are pretty accurate. I did do sense checks on the data to make sure that it was largely accurate, and we'll talk about that on the next couple of slides. I did occasional comparisons across the versions and the sites, so I spot checked for consistency or lack thereof. I calculated both the mean and the median chords over time. The mean is very sensitive to a large number of chords or the counts being off, or it may be a little bit sensitive to the counts being off. The median is relatively insensitive to the count being off. So if you pull the median and it tells basically the same story as the mean, once you aggregate the numbers, then either measure is reasonable to use, and you're not skewing things by looking at the average rather than the median. Either one will work. In the end, there were 100 songs and their chord counts for each decade. And I also looked at something, the cultural decade. For example, 1965 to 74, which would be a decade that begins on the fives, ends on the fours. A lot of people think that's how culture works. I've had that discussion for a while with people about how decades actually work, but in the end, it's really just another way to aggregate the data and another way to check the data. So on the chord counts, yes, it would be hard to exactly replicate what I did, but it's whatever you did do, it wouldn't be very far off, especially once you average over 100 observations or take the median. And in my opinion, having a person with some music background and judgment probably makes it a bit better quality data than just setting up hyper-consistency rules for a random analyst. One thing I do want to emphasize here, just as some first thoughts, that pop music does not mean great music. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not so much. So it goes across all periods, not just new music. As a reminder, the number one song of 1969, the year of Woodstock, the year of the Summer of Love, the year of great innovative things happening in the music world, it was Sugar Sugar by the Archies. So boomers, don't get cocky. So here are the data. The mean and the median by individual year, and you can see a lot of choppiness in individual years, but there's a distinct pattern through time. I pointed out 1959 as being a bit of an early outlier, as songs were pretty simplistic back then, but we had Mac the Knife, and through Chordify, I came up with a count of 38 chords for that song, which seemed correct given the number of modulations. We have another year, 1972, Candyman, Alone Again Naturally, and Without You were songs that had large numbers of chords, and in that year, the mean and the median were pushed quite a bit apart. But in most other years, they run along reasonably together. The number of chords per song peaked in 1977, which is an interesting year with a story about the mean and the median there. It was the year I graduated from college, and Jack Sikma went number 8 in the NBA draft. And that created quite a big difference between the mean and median salaries of Illinois Wesleyan graduates majoring in accounting. So there's a story about the mean and the median. When we summarize over the decade, it gets rid of some of the noise by having 100 observations. So this is just an important little lesson in sample size. Sample size makes a difference. Here the pattern becomes very clear as we see a growth in complexity from the late 50s, peaking in the 1970s, but staying high through the millennium, but then dropping off substantially to where we landed in the last decade. Not an average of 3 or 4 chords per song, but just over 5 for the average and right at 5 for the median. Ever since the 70s, at least some people I know have thought of cultural decades, largely running between the middle of the various decades. The Beatles, for example, went to the top in 1964, but really were more of a precursor for the 10 years that were to come, both in terms of changes in the general music and their own music. So here, for number of chord changes, the pattern is about as clear as it could possibly be when we look at the cultural decades. We really don't need t-tests or chi-squares or weight of evidence statistics. One can look at the picture, and on this metric, the musical landscape has clearly changed and changed dramatically over time. Finally, on this slide, I've noted the standard deviation in the counts, and when the numbers are so low as in recent years, you aren't going to have a very high standard deviation. There's just not that much variability. Probably the most interesting thing here is there was a bit more variation across songs on this metric in the 1965 to 74 and 1985 to 94 periods than in the 75 to 84 period. But also keep in mind that during the latter period, the peak average number of chords occurred in 1977. So on this metric, which tells us something not only about chords but about melodies, we see that songs have become much simpler since 2000. Ears that are used to listening to older music might not be as interested in new pop music, and perhaps vice versa. Oh, and by the way, my new album comes in at 9 chords per song, so not surprisingly, it's in the range associated with older music. Hence, I called it New Music for Old Souls. Well, to borrow an old phrase from college football, we might just call some of today's music 3 chords and a sound cloud of dust. But hey, as long as Woody Hayes was winning all those games and wasn't punching the opponents in the face, nobody cared. And it's probably a similar phenomenon today. So what might change things over in today's music? Well, eventually people will get bored with the same sounds, and there's some indication that some of that's going on. We have artists like Billie Eilish and Bruno Mars who are changing things around, but obviously it hasn't quite occurred to the point where it's showing up in numbers. In the next episode, we'll go through definitions of Spotify audio features and look at how 2 of those, danceability and energy, have changed the landscape of music over time. In the videos that follow that, we'll go through all of the Spotify features. That's all for today. See you next time.